Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be creating a card using the Wizard Friends stamp set, and I'm just going to be using this one single image as well as the Magic Sentiments stamp set. I'm starting off with this little girl here, and I'm going to stamp her 4 different times onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm going to be die cutting these later, so it doesn't really matter too much about placement, but I'm going to be coloring these all a little bit different. And this is, as Sandy Allnock says, the human rainbow. So I wanted to kind of stick to that. Each one of these will have a little bit different skin tones as well as hair color. So I'm going to show you the first one in real time, and then I'll speed everything up just so that you can see the color combinations. As always, I start with my lightest color and map out my darkest areas. My shading for her will be underneath where her bangs are hanging on her face, underneath on the bottom part of her little hands, and on the inside of her little legs. I'll go in with my darkest color, then my 2 midtones, and then finish off with that lightest color again. When I color hair, I typically start with the darkest color and use very light flick marks. I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper, and I don't over blend just because I want to have those highlights within her hair. For her hair, the shading will be where her hair is parted on top of her head and where it's kind of tucked behind her ear. She's got a ponytail that's kind of hanging off to the side. There'll be some shading in the middle of that where it's kind of tucked behind her and where the ponytail actually starts. Then I'll move on to my darkest midtone, and I'm just going to be extending those flicks out a little bit further in all of those areas in all directions. Then I'll move on to my lightest midtone, and I'm basically doing the same thing, just keeping a small highlight for my lightest color. And you can totally skip the lightest color. You can leave some of these areas white if you want her hair to look even shinier. But in this case, I did go in with my lightest color, the E53, and just blend all of that out. Now, like I said, I'll go ahead and speed up the rest of it just so that you can see the color combinations that I've used. I did do my shading in all of the same areas as far as underneath her hair and the inside of her legs. And as far as her hair, I colored it all the same. I didn't worry about any kind of curly hair for this particular card or anything like that. For this one, I'm going to have a little bit lighter of a skin tone, and I'm going to be coloring her hair red. And I'm going to kind of mix up my color families here. I'm starting off with an E marker for her hair as the darkest color. Then I'll move on to 2 YR markers, and then I'll finish off with a Y marker just to kind of brighten everything up. For my third little girl, her skin tone is going to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to be using my E18 as my darkest color, E15, E13, and E11, again shading in the same exact areas. And for her hair, I want her hair to be black. So I'm going to use my black marker, but I'm also going to be using some cool grays to kind of give some highlights within her hair. I'm going to start off with that black marker just like I did with the other one, starting off with the darkest color, putting my shading in the same area, and then I'll move on to my C7, my C5, and my C3 just for the highlight areas. Now, sometimes when you color black hair, I sometimes start with like a darker blue underneath everything, just so that it kind of shows through a little bit, just to give it a little bit of a different color rather than just black. But in this case, these images are kind of tiny, so I just stuck with the black and the cool grays. For my third little girl, I'm going to be using a little bit different of a skin tone here, a little bit darker than the first little girl, but lighter than the third. And her hair is going to be blonde. So my darkest color for her skin and her hair is going to be the E15. So I'm using both the same darkest colors here. But when I do her hair and I go on to my darkest midtone, I'm going directly over that E15 just to kind of brighten and lighten that up a little bit. I'll move on to some Y markers here, and again, leaving that highlight for my very lightest color. I added a little bit of blush to their cheeks with my R20 marker, and we'll move on to the clothing. And I'm going to be coloring these in rainbow colors as well. So for this first little girl, I'm going to be coloring her little dress and sweater red. And I'm starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. And for her little skirt there, I'm just doing little tiny triangles there on the bottom. And this will make it look like the skirt is like a little gathered or pleated. Going in with my darkest color, going over those same areas that we had mapped out. And again, just doing those little tiny triangles on the bottom. Next, for my mid-tone, I'll extend those lines out a little bit further and make those triangles just a little bit bigger and a little bit longer. Doing the same thing with my lightest mid-tone, extending those areas out as well as making those triangles a little bit bigger, and then finally going in with my lightest color, the R20, and blending all of that out. Now she's got a little necktie on here as well as her little shoes. We're going to move on to the orange of the rainbow here. And for these teeny tiny areas, I'm just using 3 colors, and you can definitely get away with 2. You can definitely get away with just 1. But I did do a little bit of shading, especially on her shoes, just putting a little bit of a darker area on the inside of the shoes and then working my way out to my lightest. Now I am going to speed this up again, but this is just mainly to show you my color combinations that I used. For the next little girl, I'm going to be coloring her dress and skirt, or skirt and sweater, I guess, with yellows. And I did do the little triangles, but yellows can be a little bit tough to blend out sometimes, so that wasn't as noticeable on this particular image. For her little tie and shoes, I'm going to be using some YG markers just because I think they go well with yellows rather than jumping right to a true green. And for my third little girl, I am going to be coloring her sweater and her skirt a true green color. And again, starting off with my lightest color, then the darkest, then the 2 midtones, and then back to my lightest. I am doing these little triangles on every single one of them just to make it look pretty much all the same. Once her little outfit was colored, I moved on to her tie and shoes. And for that, I am doing some blues and shading those, like I said, the same way. And for all of the shoes and ties, I just used 3 colors. And for their outfits, I did use 4 just because it was a little bit bigger of an area. For this final little girl, I'm going to be coloring her little outfit purple. So I'm using my V markers, again, using 4, shading these the same way with my little triangles and having a highlight right there in the center of her little sweater. And for her shoes, I'm going to be using some R markers and make these kind of like a brighter pink. Once I had all of these done, I fixed up some areas with my colorless blender. My reds for the first little girl seem to bleed a lot. And that's kind of hard to take up with a colorless blender. Reds can be tough. So I did set that aside to dry a little bit to see if that would lighten up. And unfortunately, it didn't. So I did end up having to use my gel pen. But for our panel that we're going to be adhering these to, I'm going to want some sort of a border on here. So I decided to take some Distress Oxide inks in rainbow colors. I'm using a bunch of them here. And I'm just going to be doing some ink blending on either edge of a panel of Nina Solar White cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I'm starting off with my candied apple, and I'm just putting a little bit there in each of the corners. Then I will blend that out with my carved pumpkin a little bit. Then I'll move on to fossilized amber, then twisted citron, lucky clover, faded jeans, wilted violet, and picked raspberry. Now once I get to the end, which I kind of spaced it out a little bit wrong, I guess, so I didn't leave much room for my picked raspberry, but once I get to the edge of my card panel, I'll work my way back. Sometimes I'm putting more ink on my ink blending tool, other times I'm not. I just want to make sure that these blend pretty well, and only a little bit of this is actually going to be showing, so I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend here. I just want it to kind of transition a little bit easier. Once all of my ink blending was done, I took another piece of the Nina Solar White and I cut this down to, this is still 5 1/2, but I cut it down to 3 1/2. And I'm going to touch up some of those areas that my reds bled a little bit there. The colorless blender just wasn't doing it. And then I went ahead and die cut my little girls. I took my white panel here, and I'm going to be taking some of the sentiments from the Magical Sentiment stamp set, and I'm going to be stamping that with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink, starting with the word magic. And then I did add that second stamp with the AL to make the word magical. And for my little AL, I did not get a good impression just because I did not stamp evenly, but I was able to line up my acrylic block and get a better impression, and you can't really tell. I lined up one of the words and phrases from that same stamp set using my grid mat here, pop that onto my acrylic block and stamp that with that same ink directly over my magical word. Next, I'll adhere my little rainbow panel onto an A2 size white note card using my Tombow Mono multi glue, and I'm adhering this flat. Then I will take my white panel and adhere that right directly over my rainbow piece with just a little bit of that rainbow showing on the top and the bottom. For my little girls there, I did kind of arrange those the way I wanted them, and then I will use some Scotch foam tape to pop these up. I started with the center two just to kind of get my placement right, and then added the ones on either side. Last, I added some disco ball confetti mix sequins just around that sentiment on either side, and I glued these down with my glossy accents. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.